welcome to lesson 10 of our masterclass. And this is one of my favorite sessions to talk about because I believe in this one so much, and we were able to demonstrate this during a very, very difficult time in our history as a nation and a world. Today's Leadership Unleashed masterclass theme is, drum roll, the art of the pivot. The art of the pivot. It is so important to be able to pivot in life. So when I was in high school, I played wide receiver in football. And I had to master the art of the pivot because the pivot in football was when you would plant your foot and you change your direction. And if you could change your direction quick enough, you'd create separation from the opponent. The art of the pivot is exactly the same in leadership. You must be able to plant that foot and pivot away from the opponent. And sometimes the opponent is you. Sometimes the opponent is me. A lot of times we talk about the enemies around us when they really should look at the inner me among us, which sometimes I'm the problem to my leadership. Pivoting, though, is recognizing I must plant and move in a different direction because there's an opponent in front of me. Every leader that wants longevity must master the art of the pivot. So in 2020, everybody in the world came face to face with a pandemic called coronavirus or COVID-19. Businesses shuttered, churches closed, government stopped operating. All those things happened because a pandemic globally swept across our planet. Churches in particular and businesses that I'm connected to all basically had to redefine how they did ministry for a season or ran their business for a moment. Restaurants in New York City, they built outdoor patios so people could come and eat because they weren't allowed inside. Churches weren't allowed to gather in New York State. We as a church had to immediately pivot when this happened. So when the news broke, we had our last service in the building, and then we were off for 6 weeks. We weren't really off. We just pivoted from being an in-person church to an online or digital campus church. Now, our church was ready for it because we were already broadcasting our services. But for me, we pivoted. A lot of guys in ministry pre-recorded their messages. We were one of the churches that actually were in the building preaching and having worship live in the building, and it was being broadcast live for several weeks. It was a little challenging at first to be able to just talk to a camera. Nobody's there. No one's in the room. I'm kind of a preacher. I want to hear it back. I want to hear amens. I want to see people clapping. I want to see how it engages people. But in that season, that pivot had to develop me a little bit. I had to adjust how I present, how I carry myself, and how I respond to my own teaching. In other words, I had to adjust for a season. Now, when we went through that time that everybody went through, every business, every entrepreneur, every bank, every government institution, didn't matter who, we were all facing the same thing. The businesses, the churches, the corporations that pivoted became very successful. You think about Amazon. Amazon was already an existing business, but when the pandemic came, they actually didn't have to change much, but we all pivoted to online purchasing. Think about DoorDash. Think about Uber Eats. All those things that were novelties became mandatory. Our lives pivoted, and because our lives pivoted, we made other people profits. Wouldn't it be great as a leader that your pivot made your profits? That as you adjust, you're not worried about lining someone else's pocket, but your pivots, your adjustments are bringing income, revenue, increase, and influence into your organization. That all happens because we pivot. Pivoting takes place, could be because of a pandemic. It could be because you've lost purpose. When you lose purpose, you've got to pivot rapidly and quickly so that you don't lose your way. I have found in 27 years of leadership that people lose their way when they lost their why. When you lose your reason, you've got to pivot back to it. You got to go back to it. I've had a personal mission statement my entire life of leadership, and it's simply this: at the end of the long days and late nights, did anybody hear about Jesus? That's for me. I've owned that. I've grabbed that. I've gravitated toward that. I've tried to lead like that. So everything I do, everything I say, every ministry we launch, everything I'm a part of has to get back to that purpose. It has to get to, at the end of the long days and late nights, did anybody hear about Jesus? It's all about pivoting. I've got to be able to pivot, and you got to be able to pivot quick. The bigger an organization gets, the harder it is for that organization to pivot quicker. For example, you take a speedboat. A speedboat can turn almost on a dime, but you take a cruise ship. That cruise ship, that turning radius is going to be a lot wider, and it's going to take a lot longer. When you're in a smaller organization, you can pivot really quick. As our organization's grown, the pivots, even though they're quick decisions, they often take more time to get where we want to be. Now, mastering the art of the pivot is not about speed. It is about doing the right thing. In your leadership, when you're going to pivot, when you're going to make an adjustment, you got to make sure that it's not by pressure, but it's by purpose. Let me say that one more time, and I'll slow it down. You got to make sure when you pivot, it's not by pressure, but it's always by purpose. Every adjustment you make, every decision you make has to be based on your purpose. You want to make sure that the purposes that you have designed your company, your corporation, your business, your startup for is always at the forefront. And when you deviate from that, you got to pivot right back to it. You've got to adjust right to it. Many companies that don't pivot no longer exist. For example, Blockbuster. Blockbuster was the entertainment location of every community. You'd go there, and many of you, unless you're younger or older, you wouldn't understand this. But if you're younger, let me break it down for you. It was a place where they would have DVDs where you could watch movies. You'd rent the movie, bring it back 3 days later. You could rent 2 or 3. You had a membership you'd pay for monthly. Well, there was a company that approached them and said, hey, if you don't change your business model and you don't think about online viewing, your business may not exist. Well, Blockbuster did not want to change. They were committed to their model. Well, if you're under the age of 35, you've probably never heard of Blockbuster other than maybe a reference in a movie or an old show. The reality is it failed and faltered because people did not think through the business model. They didn't pivot Blockbuster. And then what happened? Netflix took over, and the rest is history. Netflix is a multi-million dollar corporation. Blockbuster only has one store, and it's a novelty store out on the West Coast. You think about that. They did not pivot. The leader, the organization, the business, the church that does not pivot will not last. That's why the art of the pivot is so vital. You've got to be able to adjust and turn as quick as you can, and decisions need to be made rapidly. You've got to be able to make those decisions. So you don't want to operate by pressure. You want to pivot on purpose. Will this satisfy the purpose for our organization, the purpose for our nonprofit? And if it's not, you have to then make a pivot or an adjustment. Now, let me give you a caution. Don't pivot because it's sexy. Don't pivot because someone else has pivoted. Pivot because it's right for you, right for your organization, right for your ministry, right for your church. If you pivot to reflect someone else's DNA, you'll be crushed by your pivot. You should only pivot because it's right for you, it's right for your business, your startup. You make the adjustment in the right direction because it's right for you, not because it was right for somebody else. I've seen a lot of people in leadership, they'll say, well, they're doing it, so I got to do it that way. No, you don't have to do it that way. You've got to do it the right way. All the way back to the beginning of this module. The art of the pivot happens, usually it's seen in pressure, but you can't let pressure be the decision. It's about purpose. When we had to readjust our services as a church in 2020, we had to make the decision. We had to make it quick. We had to upgrade our technology. We had to do everything we could to reach people. You know what else we did? We were running TV commercials throughout all of Long Island, where our church is based, and we were asking people to watch online. Thousands were watching our services during a pandemic because we pivoted. Instead of saying, come to the building, which we couldn't at the time, we were saying, watch online. And now we look, some of the increase we experienced is because of the investment we made when we pivoted. I mean, I'm grateful that I serve and lead a church that pivots to its purpose. We're always trying to make sure that we're moving toward the purpose God called us into. And I'm honored by that, but I'm also excited about the future of our church. And I'd love for you to check out our church. If you go to mychurchunleashed.tv, you'll be able to see all the amazing things that our church is doing, and you'll be able to see firsthand the pivot that takes place often in our church. We pivot in our services. We pivot in our schedules. We pivot in our ministries. We pivot in our titles. We pivot in our outreach. We pivot in our missions giving. We pivot all the time because we always pivot on purpose. And if your organization can pivot on purpose, you will unlock your potential and unleash the leader on the inside of you and all those around you.